In this video, I will talk about wages and prices in the long run. I will focus on the UK. At the moment, many sectors experience disputes all around wages, but also around pensions. And of course, one important driving factor is the argument that prices have gone up quite substantially, while wages haven't moved that much. Or put differently, in real terms, wages are going down. The idea of this short lecture is to look at the evidence for the UK. And in a second video, I will talk more about the data and actually how to obtain the figures I will present today. So put differently, if you don't fancy going into the data and all the amazing fun you can have with it, this video is for you. I will just give you the main insights. So whenever I start any empirical investigation, I start by asking questions. And I think this is a very good idea in many ways. Number one, it avoids that I come in with a closed mind. So the idea of any empirical investigation is to look at the evidence in a more or less neutral and objective manner. Of course, to be really honest, nobody is 100% neutral and objective, so there is always a certain degree of bias, and I think I'll leave it to another video to talk about these issues, and there are many important aspects of it. But at the end of the day, I want to look at the evidence, look at the data, and the data will tell me what I should think, not the other way around. My main objective anyway, doing the activities I'm doing on YouTube is to basically teach you the methods to inquire about the data. So teach you ways to analyze data, teach you ways to collect data and to organize data so that you can get the most out of it. I will never tell you what you should think. The amazing thing about analyzing data is that it's like a puzzle, it's like a discovery. You never know what you get, and I find it still after so many years, and we talk here about 20 plus years, very exciting. For me, the starting point is asking questions. So the first thing I did ask myself is, when did the cost of living crisis start in the UK? Of course, now we have heard the term a lot, most likely cost of living crisis. So all the time in the media, you hear this term, and it refers to the fact that we experience quite high inflation rates. At the same time, we have other events going on that push up energy prices, and I'll talk about this in a minute. But the key question is, when did it actually start? So what was the trigger? Now, the next question is interesting, and I had to put it there. Is Putin to blame? So again, we want to just look at the evidence. Honestly, I don't have enough data, and I did not do enough analysis to really answer this question properly. However, we can talk about the start of the cost of living crisis and the start of the invasion and see whether these two are related. So that's a simple argument of what you call causal order. So end of the day, the past might affect the present, but the present is not very likely to affect the past, except you permit time travel. The next issue is, have real wages fallen? So that's an interesting point to make. And then we can look at specific prices. For instance, one would be food prices. Another one would be certainly energy. And of course, before we go into these questions, and I will present some of the evidence, it's important to note certain limitations. And I think that's in general very important to do, that you actually say under what conditions does the evidence really help? So first of all, we have here annual data. Now that means we stop in 2021. Now that also means that the very recent increase in prices experienced in 2022 is not yet in the data. It will be there, but we have to be patient. The benefit of using annual data is you can look at the long term. And I really want to do this because many effects you don't see in the short term. The other issue is always data quality. There is a lot to say about this. I just leave it here, and if you have any concerns, any questions, just leave a comment below. In the end, I will of course present averages. Now when we talk here about wages, we look at the average wage. Now the average doesn't mean that much. So actually, who is the average? And again, that's maybe a separate video to explore this further. Just to illustrate this, if you put your hands into fire and your feet into ice, on average you're fine. But it doesn't mean an awful lot. Yeah? So it doesn't look at the distribution of wages. And of course, we know there is a huge amount of variability. And then we have, of course, regional disparities and so on and so on and so on. So there's a lot more you have to do. But this again requires more data and more evidence. First of all, the cost of living crisis. Now, this is a term which I personally don't like. I don't like these gimmicky terms invented by the media. For me, it's much more meaningful to say high inflation. You know, that is, I can measure it. Yeah, and I have an understanding of what it means. Cost of living crisis means many different things to different people, but at the end of the day, it's a combination of an increase in inflation, very high energy prices in particular, and wages that don't keep up. So one way to figure this out is to use Google Trends. And in a separate video, I will show you exactly how you get the data and how you analyze the data using Stata, which is one of my favorite tools for that. Now, when you look at Google Trends for the UK and you type cost of living crisis, this is what comes out. Now, this is for media outlets. And it's very interesting indeed that in 2018 already, in 2019, the term is used occasionally, but nothing takes off. And then all of a sudden, and you can really pinpoint this very precisely to the 2nd of January 2022, it really takes off. Yeah, it's like a wave going up and then going down again. That's very interesting. It can be analyzed further, and there's a lot you could try to do in this case. It's about the spreading of ideas. It's a bit like, in fact, disease modeling. It's quite similar in terms of the mathematics behind it. So it's like almost having an infected brain in a way, having an idea and spreading the idea to the next person and so on. And at one point, of course, it always seems to come down eventually. And you see that also happening right now. So looking at the evidence, is quite plausible that actually this will fade out, as it usually always does in the news cycle. So mainstream media gets very excited for a short time, and then they move to the next topic. And of course, the problem actually didn't really disappear, but we just don't talk about it anymore. So for me, there are a few interesting observations here. Number one, it actually popped up much earlier, 2018, 2019, but nothing happened. It didn't take off. And all of a sudden, 2nd of Jan 2022, it took off. Of course, you can look at the data. So what does the data tell us in this particular case? We know the starting point is on the 2nd of Jan 2022. So that's here somewhere the starting point. And of course, it will be based on data in maybe the previous 1 or 2 periods. And this is monthly data provided by the ONS. So what you can see is that in January we have already inflation rates of 5.5%. Now this is based on the consumer price index. And also in the previous months, inflation was relatively high, certainly above the 2% target. So about from October in 2021, you had inflation rates in excess of 4%. And obviously after that event, shall we say, when the term cost of living crisis really picked up, you see higher inflation rates throughout. And this goes up now, the data up to September. So that's the latest available at the moment, and at the moment we are in November, so that always takes a bit of time to be updated. So the key question here is now, when did it really start? So in terms of the media, it took off in January, to be precise, 2nd of Jan. So if then people blame the invasion of Ukraine for it, it doesn't necessarily quite match, because well, based on the evidence, it happened before that. Of course, it then amplified the impact, so there's no doubt, but it would need now further analysis to really quantify this. So what you could do is you can do an intervention study, an intervention analysis to see the impact of the invasion on energy prices, and then you have to also look at the transmission of these price changes to other categories, in particular food prices, because of course there is a link between fuel prices and food prices, because you need energy to produce, but also to transport as well. And of course you have a disruption of transportation because of the war and so on, and impact on imports, exports, sanctions, and so on. So there's a lot you can analyze, but it needs a much more detailed study to really conclude. Now, what is happening to real wages? I look here really at the very, very long term. So going back to 1200 something up to the current period. And obviously we have seen a decline in real wages, so that you can't deny. So you see this drop here at the end of the period. But to be really honest, if you look at the very long-term development, well, it's all relative, isn't it? Yeah, and we had some significant drops before, and we always kind of recovered. Yeah, so is there anything to worry about? Yeah, so that's a matter of perspective. Now, very often, if you look at the very long term, it's useful to do a log transformation. The main argument for that is because growth at the end of this period becomes exponential. Again, I will talk about this more in another video. If you have any questions about this, just leave a comment below. So if you have exponential growth, if you take the log, it becomes linear. So whenever you see a straight line in the next graph, it means you have exponential growth. So taking the log, it's easier to interpret the findings, and in particular you see indeed pretty much a straight line right from about 1800 to the current period. And of course we still have a dip here, absolutely, no denying that. But in relative terms, to be really honest, it doesn't look that substantial. And of course, you see this initial wave of development of real wages, and then it slows down again, and finally it really takes off, and you have a linear development, which is exponential growth, starting around 1800. So that's what actually happens in terms of growth of real wages. So that is the Industrial Revolution, basically. So I always find it highly amusing if people, now talk about the end of capitalism because of this little dip here, ignoring the evidence of the long-term development, which is quite impressive. Now, there's a lot more to say about this, and a lot more to also criticize, for sure. We can talk about issues around climate change and so on, limits to growth. There's a lot to discuss, but also the evidence at the moment, and this is what we can discuss, would indicate, of course, tremendous development, positive development of real wages, but obviously a recent decline. Good, let's look at individual prices, and then the story becomes quite interesting. Now, what I have done here is I looked at the price of bread. To be precise, it's a particular type of bread, so it's sliced bread. It's important in the UK. When you look at individual prices of a product, there are certain benefits. The benefit of bread in particular is, first of all, it's of course a food item, so you can eat it. So we can talk about issues around can you feed yourself? Well, it's not necessarily massively healthy, but at least you get some calorie intake. The other thing about bread is it's very much standardized, yeah, and it doesn't change much. So you don't have a change in technology and all of a sudden, the bread is amazingly different from 10 years ago, which is not really the case. Yeah, and of course things have changed, but it's not as dramatic as, say, looking at cars. Or looking at property. So houses, again, are a little bit tricky to analyze over the very long term. The next thing I have done is I looked at the wages. Now, these are weekly wages. And what I do is I relate wages to the price of bread. So basically what that means is you can calculate how much bread you get for working for a week. And then I index this, starting indexing here at 1. Of course, that's arbitrary. You can index at 100, whatever you want, but it gives you a relative assessment. So the starting point here is 1968. So put differently, if you go back to 1, it means you are in the same relative position as in 1968 when it comes to buying food, which means here bread, using your wage. And obviously, you see a tremendous improvement of your position as the average worker up to the dot-com bubble. So it really improves massively. And then, of course, food price inflation happened, but of course also an impact on wages. So you see a dramatic fall. And of course, here we are in the global financial crisis, and then again, things actually improve. Yeah. So based on the current evidence, it stops in 2021. You don't see any decline whatsoever yet. But of course, having in mind 2022 is a bit different. And this is, of course, one particular food item. If you look at other food items like butter, for instance, things are different. And again, we can explore that further. But looking at this evidence here, it's not plausible to argue that you are in a worse position than 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's not in the data. Good, energy is different, so I looked at energy prices. So this is a broader measure. It includes fuel, so it includes oil and gas, including heating. So again, I do something very similar. I do an indexing to 1. Now, this time series only starts in 1988. And again, of course, it would have been nice to go a little bit further back, because then you see a bit more of a long-term perspective. So it goes only back to 1988. And what you see in line with the price for bread, you have this initial period of relative improvement. So put differently, you get more for your wage. So that's the good news. But then, of course, things have changed quite a bit. You have the impact of the global financial crisis, price changes, and so on. And recently, of course, we can argue that in relative terms, you are worse off compared to the beginning of the period. The thing is, by how much? Yeah. So if we look at the evidence here, so we are roundabout here, so we are a little bit below the 1 in 1988, but not by an awful lot. And we had certainly a far worse period before, and that's maybe roughly about 2013. I have to look into this, where we were maybe almost about 17-18% worse off in relative terms. Yeah, that's more of an issue. And again, we have to look more carefully what's going on in 2022. Then, of course, if you want to do some proper calculations, when you look at the impact of energy, then we have to look at the distribution of households. We have to look at all the additional, benefits and other things that people might obtain, which also, of course, have an impact on the relative position. I just want to quickly show you our new website. So this is terrific. So finally, there is a website. I'm not very good when it comes to web development. I'm not a front end person at all. I have no understanding of design whatsoever. I'm totally into backend because backend is where the data is. And as you know, where the data is fun. So I enjoy anything linked to backend. In particular, I quite like using Python for that. But this is, of course, all based on WordPress because it's easy. One has to be honest, it's easy. It's a bit boring, but it's easy. So that's our website. We have a few things going on here. There will be hopefully more happening. In particular, there is now a full time series course using Stata. So if you are into time series analysis, which of course you have to understand if you want to understand wages, prices, if you have to discuss models for predicting price development, there are quite a few free sessions here, so you can just check that out. So here are, the videos. You have material for downloads. So in particular, the data, some Stata do files, and so on. So plenty of fun, lots of free sessions. So then if you want to move into vector, autoregressions, co-integration, vector regression models, volatility modeling, structural breaks, panel vector autoregressions, panel co-integration, there is an awful lot more you can do. So have fun with that, and I see you in the next one.